Good evening, guten Abend, gukvel, jó estét kívánok. Welcome everyone to our online book presentation this evening. My name is Ivan Bertényi. I'm the Deputy Director of Collegium Hungaricum Wien, the Hungarian Cultural Institute in Vienna, Austria. We are going to discuss the book Maximilian Hell, 1720-1792, and the Ends of Jesuit Science in Enlightenment Europe, published last year by Brill. Two authors are with us, László from Budapest and Pippin from Tromsø, Norway. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the two commentators this evening for their contribution, two leading Austrian experts on 18th century history, Dr. Thomas WALLNING and Dr. Franz Leander FILLAFER, will share their thoughts about the book with us. Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to have a chance to cooperate with the well-known and prestigious Institut für Österreichische Geschichtsforschung again. Our goal this evening is to present a book on a scholar born exactly 300 years ago in a royal town in the northern part of the Kingdom of Hungary called Chemnitz, or Selmecbánya in Hungarian. Nowadays it is called Banská Štiavnica. It is in Slovakia. Maximilian Hell was a Jesuit priest and an astronomist. In 1756, he became the director of the Vienna Observatory. His significance can be demonstrated with the pure fact that the crater on the moon was named after him. Born in a mixed German, Slovak, Hungarian town, he presumably knew all these languages to a certain extent, but his mother tongue was German. Even so, Hell considered himself a Hungarian, at least in the sense that he was a citizen of the Hungarian kingdom. However, he had a large interest in the Hungarian language as well. Hell, with another Jesuit priest, János Sajnovics, tried to explore the already widely discussed but insufficiently documented affinity between the language of the Sami, Finns, and the Hungarians during and after their residency in Vardø in the far north of Norway, where they traveled in 1769 to observe the transit of Venus. However, this book of László KONTLER and Per Pippin ASPAAS is not a biography, or not only a biography, but this book leads the readers into the complex relationship between the Enlightenment, Catholicism, administrative and academic reform in the Habsburg monarchy, and so on. Ladies and gentlemen, although Hell does not belong to the most well-known scholars in the Hungarian history, his scientific achievements are worth of a more modern examination performed by the authors of this book. That is one of the reasons why I suggested to organize a presentation of this book to advertise the life and work of Hell to a greater audience. On the other hand, and I do not want to keep it back, I had some personal reasons too, namely, some 25 years ago, I had the chance as a student of the Eötvös University in Budapest to enjoy the university lectures of László KONTLER on the history of early modern ideas, which were far more interesting than most of the lectures held by his fellows. However, I am not an expert of 18th century history, so I do not want to make you tired with my personal remarks. Fortunately, we have a competent moderator, Dr. Zsuzsanna Török. Zsuzsa, gentlemen, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Mr. Bertényi, thank you very much for this very nice introduction. Dear colleagues, dear guests, greetings and welcome on behalf of the Institute for Austrian Historical Studies, that's Institut für Österreichische Geschichtsforschung, at the University of Vienna. My name is Zsuzsanna Török. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute, and I have the pleasure to host the book launch tonight. So as you heard, it is the monograph written by Per Pippin ASPAAS and László KONTLER, bearing the title Maximilian Hell, 1720-92, and the Ends of Jesuit Science in Enlightenment Europe. The book came out with Brill nearly a year ago, so today's book launch is a kind of a first-year anniversary of the book. And as you saw, along the hardback copy, it is also open access. Let me just give you a brief information about the online etiquette tonight. We do a video recording of the first round of discussion among the authors and the commentators. So in this part, the microphone, the video, and the chat function of the attending guests has been switched off for copyright reasons. Once the floor is opened for the general discussion, we stop the recording and you can use these functions. So let me present the authors of the volume first. Pippin ASPAAS is Senior Academic Librarian at the Arctic University of Norway, Tromsø. Holding a PhD in the history of science, his research covers the fields of science and intellectual culture in early modern Europe. He is the co-editor of the Nordic Journal for the 18th Century Studies and chairman of the Norwegian Society for 18th Century Studies. The second author of the book, László KONTLER, is professor of history at Central European University in Budapest and Vienna. His research ranges across the history of political and historical thought, including translation and reception in the history of ideas and knowledge in the early modern period. His latest English language books include Trust and Happiness in the History of European Political Thought, which was co-edited with Marc Somos. He's one of the editors of the European Review of History, Revue d'Histoire Européenne. Now to the commentators. Franz Leander FILLAFER is a research fellow at the Institute of Cultural Studies and Theatre History of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. He is a specialist of intellectual history and the history of science in their global and regional settings, with a special emphasis on the Habsburg monarchy from the 17th to the 20th centuries. His most recent book, Aufklärung Habsburgisch, Staatsbildung, Wissenskultur und Geschichtspolitik in Zentraleuropa 1750 bis 1850, came out this year, and I think quite recently, so we can also celebrate. Thomas WALLNING is Privatdozent at the University of Vienna, where he leads several research projects on early modern scholarship, intellectual history, and applied digital humanities. He was co-chair of the Coast Action Project titled Reassembling the Republic of Letters, which yielded several publications, such as the volumes Reassembling the Republic of Letters in the Digital Age and Digital 18th Century. WALLNING is chair of the Austrian Society for 18th Century Studies. And last but not least, let me say a few words about another person just evoked by Mr. Bertini, who is only virtually among us. I mean, the hero of today's evening, Maximilian Hell. Who was he? As you heard, Hell, born in 1720, came from a family of mining experts from today's Banska Štiavnica, Šemec-Bánya, a mining town in historic northern Hungary, now Slovakia. After graduating from gymnasium, he joined the Society of Jesus in 1738 and studied philosophy, natural sciences, mathematics, and theology in Vienna. He became a gymnasium teacher in Transylvania and participated in the planning and construction. She actually led this process of several astronomical observatories. He was ordained in 1751. And as you also heard in the brief introduction by Mr. Bertini, 4 years later, Hell was appointed by Maria Theresa as imperial and royal astronomer, and in 1767 received the invitation from King Christian VII of Denmark to lead an expedition beyond the Arctic Circle. And this was the crowning of his reputation as an astronomer, which meant taking part in what was the largest contemporary international collective project in astronomy, namely the observation of the transit of Venus between the Earth and the Sun. which took place in 1769. And as you also heard, the expedition lasted 2 years, after which Hell returned to Vienna, rich with astronomical measurements and calculation, as well as a unique collection of empirical material about the language of the indigenous Sami people, and contributing to the establishment of another field of scholarship, namely Finno-Ugrian linguistic kinship and the early history of Magyars. Now, until this point, the scientific life of our hero looks like a success story, but subsequent changes in European politics and culture made the odds no longer staked in his favor afterwards. And one major blow was the suppression of the Society of Jesus in 1773, ending a larger process. And whereas Hell could continue as a director of the observatory and a scientific person, his overall situation as an ex-Jesuit became precarious. And the second change came with, now I am shortening a complex process, something with Josephism in politics and culture, as well as something which the authors of the book call the breakthrough of the Enlightenment. And these changes affected deeply the cultural milieus in which Hell made part, which became for him increasingly difficult to manage. And this book is dense and has many layers: science, religion, empire, enlightenment, and my distinguished colleagues will address them in turn. But it is also a fascinating scientific biography of the Jesuit scholar Maximilian Hell, which masterfully and systematically reconstructs through 8 chapters his multiple, and I'm quoting now, 18th century life worlds and the apparent facility with which he moved among them. And what are these worlds? Well, these include the small but prosperous and self-conscious urban centers of northern Hungary and Transylvania, the imperial metropoles of the Habsburgs and the Oldenburgs, the icy wilderness of the Arctic with the opportunities it offered for scientific exploration of natural phenomena as well as human diversity, the cosmopolitan and hierarchical Society of Jesus, and the cosmopolitan and apparently non-hierarchical Enlightenment Republic of Letters. Moving across these life worlds required immense resources, and the book can be read as a story of the increasingly dramatic effort of the hero to balance and master them. So there is a narrative tension building up, which binds the subchapters and chapters into a coherent unity. And had I not known that the 2 authors had started working on Hell independently of each other at different places, I would have assumed they designed the book together from the very beginning. So my question, before inviting the 2 commentators to join the conversation, I would like to ask you, Per, and then László, what attracted you to the figure of Maximilian Hell?
Thank you very much for your introduction. It's a great honor to be here. And I'm now trying to say something about what attracted me to this character here. My background before I started on this PhD project, which is within the history of science, I was actually trained a Latinist. So I was used to reading books 2,000 years ago, written 2,000 years ago, and they had no relation to the region in which I live, the Arctic parts of Norway. So I wanted, after graduating, to move closer, both in space and time, if possible. So one of the things I was interested in was the breakthrough of modern botany with Carl Linnaeus from Sweden, who wrote a lot of work in Latin, of course, so I could use my language competence and also move closer. But it was when I came across this guy here, Maximilian Hell, that I really found something that I could dig deep into. Here he is after successfully traveling to Vardö. Here he is in his so-called Sami dress or Lappish garment. From this expedition, there is so much material preserved, among them maps such as this one, not very many maps, unfortunately, but you see a very detailed depiction of Vardø, and with his observatory in the middle of the town. I won't go into any details, but as I said, it was a successful observation. And when I started reading official reports from the expedition to Vardø, it struck me as something far more than modern science usually gives. There are narratives there are descriptions of people they met and how they interacted with the local population in Vardø while doing these observations. And there were plans for many publications, and Hell also advertised this grand 3-volume work on the expedition. So this was what I found out very early when I started exploring this expedition. So I wanted to find out what was preserved in terms of manuscripts and unpublished work. So I received a small stipend to go to Vienna, to the University Observatory of Vienna, where they still keep the largest amount of Hell's original manuscripts. As I said, rich material. One of the aspects which has made this expedition very famous is the interactions with the local Sami population. And when you study more closely some of the materials from the expedition, you can see that, for instance, here, Hell has depicted his own expedition tent. Where is it placed? Well, not close to the church, which is marked with letter A, and also not close to the house of the priest of this local village, but in between the tents of the Sami. So this was a very important study object during the expedition. So this was fascinating to me, as I said, closer in space and time than I usually went with my Latin. When I went to Vienna, I got to see the original manuscripts, and there's so much material preserved there, not by Hell, but by his travel companion and scientific assistant, Johannes Scheinowitsch, or János Scheinowitsch. The most important work, some would say, from the expedition was not so much the astronomical data that they assembled, but this Finno-Ugrian linguistic discovery that they contributed to. But it was a really an expedition with enormous ambitions, and Hell was always inscribing himself into this Enlightenment narrative. So some of the outcomes were actually a small piece arguing for a new preservation against scurvy, or Skorbut, as it's called in German. Also, he tested out various devices to heal patients with magnetic steel magnets, some of which are preserved. So that is the sort of the internal scientific ambitions of Hell, but of course, he is inscribed in a much larger context, the cultural, intellectual history of the Habsburg realm. And I guess this is where I should leave the floor to you, László.
Okay, thank you very much, Per. And well, thanks first of all to Zsuzsa and Ivan for making this happen. Indeed, this is a kind of birthday party for the book, which came out almost exactly a year ago. There's a background story as well. There was already a presentation planned in May at the IfÖG, which was swept away by COVID, and I'm very pleased that this is now made up for. I'm also thrilled to see so many other colleagues joining us. I'm having the list of names on the right side of the screen. The list contains many of those who have been extremely helpful for Per and myself as we were working on this book. So let them be thanked once again. And it's a shame that we can't list them individually now. Now, Zsuzsa's question was what fascinated us and what brought us to Hell and what brought the book together. You know, I first became interested in this story also from the Finno-Ugrian angle. Long ago, I was invited to participate in a project exploring early modern discourses of otherness, how European identities are shaped by encountering certain ethnographic others. And as I was thinking of what I could contribute, I just remembered the enormous amount of consternation which Hungary's educated and social elites felt upon being confronted with their possible Finno-Ugrian Lappish kinship, because they much preferred to figure themselves as deriving from the valiant warrior peoples of the steppe. So I felt that it's an interesting question how you configure your present identity by distancing yourself from your former selves, which are being othered. So this brought me to Schleinovich, but I then discovered that hell is a far more complex and interesting figure. In parentheses, I must add that in answer to the question, what fascinated me about this, it was the work with Pippin ASPAAS, which is another highly contingent story. You become interested in a figure or in a topic, and you start an internet search, and then stumble upon the name of some other people who seem to be working on the same topic. You take contact, you meet at a conference, then you are invited to the PhD defense of the person. Of a dissertation which was written on the very same topic. So it's a fascinating story itself about how the Republic of Letters works in the early 21st century. Now, coming back to hell, the other thing which I enjoyed very much was that Ivan kindly mentioned, recalling sweet memories from the more distant past, my previous identity of having worked in the history of political thought and intellectual history, that is grappling with complicated ideas, and it was extremely refreshing now to grapple with a highly complicated and complex person and uncover the lived experiences which he accumulated over a fascinating career, working simultaneously or one after the other in several life worlds. Zsuzsa, I think, very appropriately cited some sentences from the book. Indeed, how this very idiosyncratic individual moves with ease between these highly diverse life worlds. Talking about idiosyncrasies, I think Per would agree with me that the guy must have been a terrible person. He must have been irritating, self-conceited, irritable, sanguinic, and so forth, but he carved out a feasible existence for himself, one after the other in these very complicated situations, and pursued with a great amount of determination his ends. Now, in fashionable social science language, one could say that he took enormous pains to accumulate as much socio-cultural capital as possible in each of these worlds, so that if a deficit arises in one of them, he can carry further this capital from one into the other, which becomes very significant as the environment around him changes dramatically. It's a lifetime. He lives his adult years between the 1740s and 1790s. Dramatic changes within the Habsburg monarchy and all across the Europe and globally. And it's extremely exciting to see how, like an eel, he flexibly adjusts to all kinds of predictable and unpredictable transformations. So ultimately, it's a story of how a man of science, what can a man of science do in rapidly changing circumstances when, for political, social, cultural reasons, the breathing space becomes thinner around him. What can and what cannot men of science do in such circumstances? And as I'm saying this, I realized that when we started working on this project with Per, I started becoming interested in this over 10 years ago. With Per, we met, I think, 11 or 12 years ago, and then we decided to put together what we have and test how the complementarities between our skills might work to the best possible ends. So when it started, I could not have predicted that I and my university might be subject to the same kinds of imperatives and pressures by the time the book is published. So retrospectively, the book turns out to be having some kind of autobiographical relevance. Yeah, I think I should rather stop here because time is running fast, and give the floor to our commentators.
Yeah, thank you very much, László. And indeed, Franz, would you join in with the comments?
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for the invitation. I'm having a treat here for you. This is the book. There is a copy, which I'm very glad to show you, and I'm the proud possessor of this wonderful book. Well, first of all, let me thank you for the wonderful invitation, and let me congratulate Per and László on a really superb and trailblazing book. I had, if I'm permitted to use this pre-rehearsed pun, hell of a good time reading the book. And I'd like to say that the authors succeed beautifully in placing the Jesuit astronomer Maximilian Hell at the interface of several adjacent domains that are rarely studied in conjunction. And this is actually why readers can reap such rich benefits from the book. Written by two authors, the book is actually also a product of what it describes, namely of a commercium literarium, regional commercium that straddles many frontiers to successfully reintegrate the various dimensions of Hell's scientific persona. I'm going to mention three main domains that strike me as original. First, Hell's stature as a clerical scientist who served as a liaison man between the Jesuit and the meta-confessional Republic of Letters. His identity as a Hungarus, already mentioned, as a patriotic citizen of a multilingual kingdom of Hungary, who combined civic urban pride with an artisanal pedigree of mining bailiffs and engineers. And third, Hell's and travails of empire. The second issue concerns the voyage, already mentioned, and the third brief issue will be on the Finno-Ugrian kinship theory. First, on the issue of enlightenment in the church, of knowledge. It was an engine of social advancement for talented commoners, but also acted as an interregional switchboard within the monarchy. Its novices and professors went through assignments in many different locations and also swapped the subjects they taught. And it is this context which is very crucial and beautifully illuminated in the book in its relevance for Hell. At the same time, the Jesuits formed a major brain trust for the pursuit of enlightenment under governmental performance requirements, as e.g. in the case of Hell's mentor, Joseph Franz, who is also given some prominence in the book, the founder of the Oriental Academy of Vienna and plenipotentiary commissioner for the standardizing of the monarchy's weights and measurements. This enlightenment was a practical project to chart the heavens and to survey the Habsburg territories, as well as a project to weed out superstition, false beliefs in the Catholic world. Now, it is in this context that clerical institutions found their proper sales pitch. They were indispensable bastions of learning and catalysts of enlightenment directed against superstition and untrammeled free thinking. It is in this context that Hell's Newtonianism hits its full stride, but it was not the only Catholic conceptual resource geared to preserving ecclesiastical learning in an enlightened empire. It's instructive, I think, to briefly contrast the Newtonian paradigm with one of these strands, namely with Wolffianism. For the Wolffians, Catholic pupils of Christian Wolff, revelation remained the key prerequisite of supreme knowledge, of acquiring supreme knowledge. Whereas for the Catholic Newtonians, they devised a pious empiricism that evinced the intelligent cosmic design of a benevolent creator, a universe whose purpose and final aim remained inscrutable to man. And thereby, these Newtonians, like Hell, pursued, it seems to me, two aims: to curb speculation in religious matters and to buttress the position of clerical science. And both of these aims didn't quite turn out to materialize as they expected. By celebrating the significance of God as creator and of the laws of the universe, they produced a foreclosure effect by separating the knowledge of God from the knowledge of nature. So Jesuit scientists midwifed secularized natural science, but cut the ground from their own feet. This is an interesting story which László and Per succeed in fleshing out brilliantly with all the distribution battles and skirmishes going on. And what struck me as particularly original is the story of Hell's confrontation with Ignaz von Born. Now, Hell, as we know, garnered considerable international fame for his observation of the Venus transit and calculation of the solar parallax, which after Kepler's third law allowed for the calculations of planetary distances in the solar system. Now, when suppression of the order hit in 1773, Hell was clutching for straws. Now, László mentioned this idea of cultural or social-cultural capital being accumulated, but of course it begs the question whether the capital can actually be converted within fields, among fields, whether it turns into junk bonds of fake money when being converted. Now, in the case of Hell, he was trying to found an academy. There's this famous quote from Maria Theresa saying, well, I couldn't possibly found an academy with 3 Jesuits and a chemist. I would make a laughingstock of myself. But Hell actually intended to found an academy exclusively for the exact sciences. And that's something which I think needs to be emphasized. Why? Because it is interesting to see this infrastructural transition from the Jesuit strongholds of learning to the Masonic strongholds of learning, the Freemasons. The Freemasons volunteering in a sense to step in and fill the gap left by the Jesuits with their special academies, with their training lodges and so forth. Now, Hell's attempt to found this academy fizzled out without any result, but Ignaz von Born, the geologist and Freemason who praised Hell back in the 1770s as one of the most illustrious Austrian scientists, changed track in the 1780s when we have this rivalry between the Freemasons and the ex-Jesuits, and in 1783 wrote a very interesting pamphlet lampooning Jesuit called Telescopum Christiano Hellianum, and Born portrays Hell as a bigoted obscurantist who had ascended from matters astronomical even higher to purely divine subjects. Now, if you remember Hell's anxious separation of exact sciences and religion for his planned academy, this is a piece of character assassination by Born. But Born's message was clear. Jesuit science was depleted of any prestige. Scientists in a clerical garb had no longer any authority over the kind of moral authority of nature. And by tarnishing them as metaphysicians, kind of one floor above the firmament, divine matters, Born ousted these scientists from their home base and claimed it for secular naturalists, for people like himself, and also fashioned himself as the only legitimate practitioner of Enlightenment, which is an interesting story in itself. Now to my second point about the voyage. Now the book is also very interesting, I find, because it reveals a kind of intermarginal and interlocking story about self-enhancement that connects the fringes of European Enlightenment. In this case, the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway and the Viennese Jesuits. It's an interesting story in itself. Now, on the story on the journey with other big journeys. On the one hand, Denmark-Norway had a distinguished pedigree in the Felix Arabia expedition done by Niebuhr previously. On the other hand, it's interesting to see how the two actually traveled. While Maria Theresa's botanist of choice, Jacquin, on whom there is a wonderful recent book, Marianne Clemoon, and Helga Hünel, and he took, which is also written in the book, 102 pairs of shoes to the Caribbean to display his status. What Scheinovich and Hell took with them was a portable little altar to celebrate Mass in secret, clandestinely during the night, because monks were officially banned from Denmark-Norway with the threat of the death penalty. Nevertheless, they were invited to do this expedition, and they asked the Pope to waive the duty of wearing the cassock and so forth. What I find interesting, apart from this intriguing cooperation between underdogs in the International Republic of Letters, is the inter-imperial dimension of the voyage. As omnivore polymaths, Helmich left no stone unturned. They studied the receding sea level and its impact on fishery, the luminescence of the ocean, the kind of milky seas during the polar night, the aurora borealis, and the oceanic fauna, with Scheinovich's delicate collection of hermit crabs being eaten up by the mice of Vardø. But equally importantly, Scheinovich and Hell reflect on diversity management in a multilingual and multi-religious polity, in a composite polity as their own. So they liaised with Knut Lehm, the professor at the Trondheim Seminarium Laponicum, and I love the gem the authors placed there on the politics of confessional uniformity in Denmark-Norway, impelling the Sami, who pastured their herds on Norwegian territory in the summer, to carry attendance certificates by the priests of the Swedish region they spent the winter in, so as to make them eligible for communion in Norway during their stay there. Now, en route, Hell and Scheinovich transactions with the Sami established a direct link between the Danube Basin and the Polar Circle, and among the many exciting dimensions of the book, its exploration of the Finno-Ugrian kinship theory stands out as a particularly rewarding aspect, which brings me to my last point. The Finno-Ugrian kinship theory caused much discontent among the Hungarian society of ranks, because it sapped the venerable Hun or Scythian ancestry of the Hungarians and thereby threatened the noble republic of privileged aristocrats under heavy attack during the Maria Theresian reforms. While the linguistic aspect of Scheinovich and Hell's work has been brilliantly studied by Juladar, the authors plausibly argue that Adam Franz Kolar, Hell's erstwhile Jesuit co-novice, court librarian and critic of Hungarian noble and ecclesiastical privilege, and Gerard van Swieten lurked behind this discovery. They beautifully show the Hungarian refractions of the Enlightenment history of mankind, something I found particularly interesting, when linguistic similarities are discarded as superficial characteristics, while the customs are invoked in a very peculiar way. Usually customs are something tied to a sequence of stages and malleable emerging traits. In the Hungarian case, the attack on the superficiality of linguistic similarity is underpinned by an argument for the eternal quality of customs, which is very interesting in itself. It's a very, very beautiful point. And what is also very innovative, I think, is how the authors managed to recover the internal rift within the Jesuit Republic of Letters, which emerges from the conflict between the Jesuit historian Pry and Hell. Now, Pry promoted a historical, paleographical, or philological mode of inquiry, while Hell wished to colonize the study of history with his deductive style of inquiry. He speaks of the stringent formal logic proofs. And to burnish his credentials, he speaks about the certitudo of a mathematician, to which a historian couldn't possibly have any access, and garnishes this with something of a threat, saying, "Don't mess with me," to Pry, unless, quote, "Pry wishes to make an enemy of me, the mathematician, and thus the fiercest of critics." Now, it's very interesting to see the different fault lines within the Jesuit Republic of Letters, and between the Jesuit and the Confessional Republic of Letters. Now, to wrap up, I would say that the book is very stimulating on two counts for two questions that actually I also try to grapple with in my own research, which is namely, what was Enlightenment and what was the Habsburg monarchy? Two big questions. I think pondering the hell evidence, one gets away from being trapped in the 18th century language of true versus false enlightenment, or of pure versus impure enlightenment, enlightenment of ideas versus something institutionalized or practical. This is a non-tenable distinction. All enlightenment was practical and impure. That's what we get is very important, I think, in the current discussion about radical, moderate, and so forth. What's also interesting is to see how all these trajectories of the people studied in the book, they transcend and in some cases even destroy their conditions of emergence. So that's very important, I think, very important point. And Newtonianism, unmooring the knowledge of nature, the knowledge of God, is indeed a very good point to underscore this case. So summing up, I would say that the book's general gist reminds me of an observation made by Johann Gottfried Herder in 1769 on his big journey in this fantastic travelogue, Journal meiner Reise, where he says, enlightenment is always open-ended, unpredictable, it is always a means, not an end. A little play on the title of the book. And if it gets an end, it ceases to be enlightenment. So thank you so much for your attention.
Many thanks, Franz, for these wonderful comments. Now I would like to ask Thomas to deliver his.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and also I do have a story with this project since in 2016, Peer, in a context of the Republic of Letters cost action, talked me into that project in Warsaw during a coffee break while we were queuing up. I'll be brief. I first of all would say that the book deserves praise because it's a good read, and at the same time it speaks to an expert public. It is a book that you would really like to hand over to your students to not only learn about the hero and his context, but also about these trajectories that meet in him and with him. And I repeat what has been said, it is also a pleasure to see the shelf of books about intellectual history in the Habsburg monarchy of the 18th century being increasingly stuffed with books like this, adding Franz's Aufklärung Habsburgisch and Marianne Clément's, Helga Hünel's book on Chacun, which does have some similarities, and I'll perhaps come back to that. My first point, and now I would like to invite you, if I find the chat, I will share what you all already have. That is the electronic version of the book. I'd like to ask you to follow me to page 394. So it's 408. Actually, when you use the PDF, you'll find there the Austrian province of the Society of Jesus. And my first point is bearing the title Jesuits. What does Jesuit mean? I'd like to emphasize something that I found in my work on the Benedictines and that should not be forgotten. Religious communities / orders underwent a fundamental restructuring in the decades, centuries after the Council of Trent. In order to form manageable unities, they were asked to form provinces if there had not been provinces before, and newly founded orders would have these provinces as their points of reference. If you look at the Austrian province, there's a very nice map, and there is the list of the colleges pertaining to the Austrian province. You'll see two things. You'll see that much of Hell's biography can be traced in that context. So there's 10 stations there. And you'll see that this, to some degree, prefigures what later becomes a knowledge space of Central Europe in the Habsburg monarchy. The parts of the Habsburg monarchy that would not be part of the Austrian province are Tyrol, the western parts, and Bohemia. But the rest comes together here. And this is important not just for the circulation of personnel, but also for the circulation of information. If you think of the Litterae Annue that circulated. So this is the space in which this communication is happening. And I was, this is a little bit bold, but I was always intrigued by the idea that before we have this rolling out of a Habsburg bureaucratic infrastructure of buildings, of offices, you do have something similar from the 17th century on in ecclesiastical infrastructure. And this is something clearly visible here that should point to the fact that this was Habsburgian even before it became Habsburgian. Franz pointed to this when he talked about the academy plans. And indeed, page 392, they will call it a virtual refuge for ex-Jesuit science. So we should really think about these spaces in conjunction to one another. My second point would pick up from page 23 and talk about science. I found the book most intriguing in its way of showing a field of knowledge in transition. Astronomy is not just any kind of scientific discipline, but it's a discipline with which the Jesuits already have a history by the middle of the 18th century. And this fact is very nicely underscored by these pages to which I pointed you. The authors talk about Clavius, one could mention Scheiner, and one could mention actually this situation of the early 17th century in which it was not a granted outcome that Catholic science would side against the new science. Indeed, we're reminded that much of the problems, and there has been a lot of research on that, some of the problems in the Galileo affair also relate to the conflict between Jesuits and Dominicans. So we should think, and this is a little bit provocative, but try to think with me as the period between the 1620s and the 1740s, 30s, 40s, as an interval in which the Jesuits could not really engage or officially engage with what was going on in the sciences. We all know that they actually always did. They needed to know what they had to censor. And this is something that I also learned from Peer. There is a particular discourse about astronomy being a Irenic, ecumenic discipline, which, for example, was brought up when Leibniz was trying to convince the Curia with regards to the church reunification projects, and was pointing to potentially shared calendar calculations in order to re-synchronize the calendars. So the idea of having an epistemological base that would be shared and could not be contested on confessional grounds made astronomy attractive point of reference. And indeed, I'd say that there was the moment when in the first couple of decades of the 18th century, Jesuits started to build observatories. We mentioned Joseph Franz. We have the French Jesuits engaging with Newtonianism. And then, and this was mentioned by Franz before, they also had to resolve the natural philosophy problem behind that. However, both Christian Newtonianism and Wolffianism offered a way of basically sticking to experimental physics while at the same time safeguarding whatever theological content they wanted to safeguard. And in this sense, and this is my point, we're looking at something that is an adaptation of something extraneous into a Christian paradigm. And this is something that has been happening in Christian intellectual history throughout. Again, a little bit provocative, but if you think of St. Augustine, looking at ancient pagan culture and trying to distinguish between what is useful in terms of rhetorics, in terms of poetry, as opposed to what is good in faith, we face a similarly functioning adaptation discourse. And this is what I find so fascinating, to see Hell being part of that, appropriating that, and coming to the ends, obvious pun again, at the moment in which a more determined and kind of enlightenment of the Freemasons then takes over. So these are perhaps my two major points of fascination and perhaps ways to look at this book.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And now I would like to ask the two authors to react, if they can, briefly to these comments. Who would like to start?
Let's keep alphabetical order. Per, you go first.
I see there is a connection problem with Per, so I would suggest that you begin. Okay,
yeah, I see the signs are transmitting contradictory messages about Per's whereabouts. Thanks a lot to both of you, Franz and Thomas, for raising these issues, and also for the generous praise. I'm very pleased to hear about your ultimate satisfaction with the book. Now, where to start? Maybe I should start with the last points. Thomas's references to the character of astronomy as an ironic science, an ecumenical one, which in a certain sense it certainly is. In many senses, the whole of, and you drew a contrast between the new science and the Jesuits and Jesuit astronomy. In a certain sense, isn't the whole of the new science, as designed by the 17th century founding fathers, a kind of ecumenical project. If you look at Bacon, the advancement of learning, it's set out with a great deal of clarity that science is a cultural practice aimed to create a space in which it is possible to arrive at truth claims demonstrated clearly and distinctly and beyond the possibility of any further contestation, unlike civic and religious discourse, which mar 17th century societies. So science is a kind of ecumenical or irenic antidote to these, because in that it is a realm in which it is possible to arrive by reasonable arguments to these truths without further doubt. And in this sense, since it is a cultural project which shifts attention from truths in religion which are incapable of being demonstrated, in a sense, this points towards a kind of enlightenment in that very minimal pragmatic definition, which is promoted by scholars like John Robertson, that enlightenment is the accumulation about sound knowledge about our physical, natural, moral, etc., environment, with a view to improving that environment in this world, without much concerned with what comes after it. Now, that is the point, I believe, that hell maybe brought into the discussion, brought it back into the discussion, because for hell it is of supreme importance that what comes after. So in many ways, I think that because obviously to the story, the connection between hell, the Jesuits, and the Enlightenment is completely crucial. And here I may refer back to what Franz told us about Wolffianism and Newtonianism. And I just regret that Aufklärung Habsburgisch did not come into our hands before we completed the manuscript, because the Wolffian Newtonian distinction sound really crucial, and we ought to have reflected on it in a more direct manner. So hell and enlightenment. So indeed, hell is a figure who flourishes in the infrastructures of communication and knowledge production and exchange and so forth, brought into life by the Enlightenment, and contributes very actively and productively to improving those infrastructures. So he is, in a way, part of the Enlightenment world, this material universe that is created by the 18th century cultivation of knowledge. At the same time, however, without participating in what one might call the moral universe of the Enlightenment. Certain fundamental values which are still shared widely of Enlightened. I mean, like talking about Irenicism, ecumenicism, yes, he gets on very well with Protestant men of science, as long as it as the exchange is confined to participating in producing, strictly speaking, scientific knowledge. But he hates Protestants. The very idea of ecumenicism, Irenicism, toleration is completely foreign to him. And then the other thing which has come up, Franz wrote in very nicely, Ignaz von Born and the Freemasons and so forth, and this cleavage between the kind of useful knowledge which the Bornians and the Masons are producing, and the kind of pure sciences which Hell's Academy would have been about. And this is, again, a fundamental distinction, and Hell complains profusely about the court and the government and the Austrian political leadership having embraced a notion of science which is fundamentally diametrically opposed to the idea of science cultivated by the Jesuits and by good Catholics, which is about pure knowledge, which is about not knowledge instrumentalized. It is knowledge which can be put into the service of certain higher ends, like the better access to the divine truth. In Hell's oeuvre is replete with references to the cultivation of scientific knowledge in conjunction with the slogan of the Jesuit order, for the greater glory of God. It is for the greater glory of God. It is inspired by the Supreme Being. That knowledge is cultivated by the Jesuits, unlike in Born's substitute academy, the Masonic Lodge zur wahren Eintracht, which also has its series of communications, physikalische Arbeiten, physical works about the various kinds of material resources of the Habsburg monarchy, with a view to channeling it into the service of the improvement of material conditions of the peoples of the monarchy, and on this basis, the improvement of the opportunities of governmentality offered by a reformist government. So that's indeed a major cleavage, and that's very much behind the increasing bitterness which hell feels and formulates as we move from the 1770s to the 1780s. So whereas in the early phase, the late 40s and the 50s, there seems to be a fundamental unity of purpose between the reforming government and the Jesuits. You referred to Father Franz and all those others who are instrumentalized by the government on a purely meritocratic basis in the 50s and the 60s in the academic and university reforms. Then comes the bifurcation with this breakthrough of a kind of enlightenment from below. Not so much from below, but still from different angles, from different corners than the situation had been up to the 1760s. And I'm trying to think what else I could react. And let's try to check whether Per has been able to join us again, because I think I'm talking too much and we are close to being beyond our allotted time. And I'd like to create an opportunity to Per to give his contributions. And thanks a lot again, Thomas and Franz, for wonderful contributions. Thank you.
Yeah, just to follow up on the gratitude part, it's a great honor to have all this praise. I'm not used to that at all, to be honest. It's one thing that I would like to pick up on is what Franz mentioned on the fringes of European Enlightenment, which is sort of the Jesuits are not and were not considered the quintessential Enlightenment protagonists, right? So they were somehow on the outskirts of that rhetoric. And also Denmark, Norway were struggling to have a position as a sort of a great power of science in the northernmost parts of Europe, because they had lost reputation on many fields, and the Swedes were on the rise with, as I mentioned, Carl von Linné, the great botanist, and who sent out numerous expeditions across the world, or personnel to expeditions such as Cook's circumnavigations, etc. The Swedes were participating and delivering great contributions to science in the time. So it was very important for Denmark to position itself as a great power within this field of science. And this is where I think actually Hell's rhetoric worked, like portraying himself as the imperial and royal astronomer, dealing with exact sciences, and that's that. There was not much on his CV, not much that he had published that were sort of into theology or anti-Lutheranism, etc. on the time that he received his invitation, that is. So by that time, or up until that time, he had no reputation as a religious how do you say it, protagonist or entering sort of these debates. So he was portrayed as a purely scientific representative of astronomy, and not so much as a Jesuits, and in that sense, as the representative of cutting-edge astronomical science at the time, he was useful for Denmark, Norway. He was a useful candidate to dispatch to the far north. What captivates me with this character, whom I would agree with László, who can't have been very sympathetic, but what captivates me is this: he got an assignment to do one astronomical observation, was supposed to last for 6 hours, as one astronomical phenomenon, the transit of Venus. Go all the way to Vardar and then straight back. But he expanded this assignment to so much more. So he embarked upon all these sub projects that some of them actually grew into some the major parts. And this is also something that's we try to treat in our book, not to see him so much as the purely scientific astronomer, because I think that's not the case. He was so much more, and thank you for pointing to so many other dimensions of his career and his work.
Thank you, Per. Now, at this point, I think we arrived at the end of the first round.